I'll never forget the day I stumbled on the truth about Lily and Ryan. It was a regular Wednesday evening, and I was sifting through a stack of old mail and bills on my desk. Bills, receipts, paperwork, most of it junk. But then there was this one little receipt that caught my eye. It was from a coffee shop across town, this cozy little place with dim lights and secluded booths, the kind of spot you'd go to if you didn't want to be seen. I turned the slip over, feeling a chill run through me. Why would she be there? She hadn't mentioned anything about meeting anyone. I sat there for a minute, just staring at the receipt, telling myself it was probably nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this little piece of paper was some kind of puzzle piece. I went back through our joint bank statements, and I started noticing more charges at places I'd never been to with her. A couple of dinners, a movie theater on the other side of town. Nothing too obvious at first, but together, it started to paint a different picture. My heart pounded as I pieced it all together. Suddenly, I remembered all those late nights at work, the weekends she needed to herself to clear her mind. And I believed her. Lily had always been calm and confident, the kind of person who could make you feel like you were the one being unreasonable. Whenever I had doubts before, she'd talk me down with a smile or a reassuring look, telling me how much she loved our life together. And I believed every word. But there it was, plain as day. She'd been lying to my face, sneaking around, and not with a stranger but with someone we both knew. Ryan. Someone I'd never imagined would betray me like this. My stomach twisted, and I felt this cold anger settle deep inside me, stronger than I'd ever felt before. I wasn't just some guy she could deceive, and I was done being her fool. I didn't confront her right then. No, that would have been too easy, too predictable. I wanted them to feel the same sense of shock, betrayal, and pain that was gnawing at me now. I wanted them to know they couldn't just walk away from this without consequences. And that's when the idea for revenge came to me, fully formed. Not a reckless, angry burst, but something patient and careful, something that would cut deeper than any confrontation. They wanted to play their little game in secret? I'd show them a game of my own, one that they'd never see coming. Planning revenge wasn't exactly something I'd done before, but once the idea settled in my mind, I couldn't let it go. I was always the patient, steady one, the guy who played by the rules. But this was personal. Every time I thought about Lily's easy lies or imagined Ryan smirking behind my back, it only fueled my resolve. First things first, I needed to get them together. That's where the weekend retreat idea came in. I remembered how Lily had been talking about wanting a quiet weekend away, saying she needed a break from the stress of everyday life. Funny, I'd always thought we were handling things pretty well. But now it seemed like the stress she wanted to escape was me. So, I played along. I booked a cabin in the woods, far enough from town that they'd be isolated, but not so far that I couldn't keep an eye on them. Then, I sent Ryan an anonymous message from a burner email, making it sound like it was from Lily. It read something like, "Alex is away that weekend, and I need to see you. Let's make this our time." I felt a bitter satisfaction as I typed it out. It was unsettling how easy it was to imitate her voice, to predict exactly how she'd invite him without raising any suspicions. But the main part of my plan wasn't about getting them alone in the cabin. No, that was just step one. The real kicker was the phones. I bought 2 identical models to theirs, loaded with the texts and chats I'd carefully crafted. I'd spent hours compiling messages that would slowly unveil just how deep their affair ran. Messages that would cut, shock, and twist the knife in all the right ways. Once I had their phones set up, I'd planned to switch them out the night before they left. With everything in place, I was ready. But then came the tricky part, acting normal around Lily. Every time I saw her now, I'd get that same rush of anger, the urge to just tell her I knew everything. But I bit my tongue, smiled when I needed to, and played the part of the trusting husband. A few days before they left, I casually mentioned the cabin booking to her. She looked at me, eyes wide with fake surprise, and tried to play it off with a little laugh, saying, "Oh, honey, that sounds amazing. Just the break I needed." Watching her lie like that, pretending she was excited to go by herself, I had to clench my jaw to keep from saying something that would ruin it all. I let her think she was getting away with it. Let her believe that she had me right where she wanted. Little did she know, she and Ryan were about to find themselves in a game they didn't even know they were playing yet. The night before Lily's retreat, I made my move. She went to bed early, leaving her phone charging on the nightstand. After she was asleep, I slipped in, swapped her phone for the preloaded one, and took hers with me downstairs. My heart pounded, but she didn't stir. She looked so peaceful lying there, like she wasn't about to walk headfirst into a trap. I almost laughed at the irony. I'd timed it perfectly. Lily would leave at dawn, claiming she wanted to get an early start to unwind. I knew exactly where she'd go, too. A little side road diner just outside of town where she and Ryan would meet up before heading to the cabin. So, a few hours after she left, I swapped my own phone for Ryan's, which I'd managed to swipe earlier that week. He hadn't noticed it missing yet, probably figured he'd just left it at his gym or something. Perfect cover. The burner phones I'd set up weren't just random replacements. They were loaded with exactly what I wanted them to see. Messages that hinted at secrets, accusations, and doubts, all laced with enough poison to drive them nuts. As far as Lily's phone would show, Ryan had been talking to another woman, a fictitious Marissa, who sent just enough innocent texts to make Lily suspicious but leave her unsure. On Ryan's, there were similar messages from a James, an old friend who I made sound like he'd always had feelings for Lily. These weren't just casual conversations. I'd gone back and forth, creating a whole story in these messages, a string of doubts and accusations, the kind that could eat away at anyone's trust. The idea was simple. By the time they reached the cabin, they'd be wondering about each other, second-guessing every little thing. All it would take was one or two pointed comments or glances to get them spiraling. And with those phones in their hands, they wouldn't even need me there to pull the strings. But I wanted to be close enough to watch it all play out. I rented the cabin right next door. They'd never see me, but I'd be close enough to keep tabs on them. In the days leading up to it, I prepped everything: binoculars, a voice recorder, and a plan to keep out of sight. If they ever stepped outside, I'd have a front row seat. That morning, when Lily finally left, I watched her drive off with this strange, bitter satisfaction brewing inside me. It wasn't quite joy, but there was something deeply satisfying about knowing she was finally going to understand what betrayal felt like. I had no doubt that by the time the weekend was over, they'd be so wound up with suspicion and paranoia they wouldn't know which way was up. I got in my own car and drove up to the cabin. Once I arrived, I settled in, watched as they pulled up together, bags in hand, laughing like they had no idea their little secret was unraveling right in front of them. From here on, it was just a matter of time. From my spot in the cabin next door, I watched them unload the car, acting like they were in some romantic getaway. They probably thought they were untouchable, that no one knew a thing. The sight of them laughing and glancing at each other like giddy teenagers sent a sharp stab through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't about rage, it was about seeing them unravel bit by bit. I stayed low, close enough to catch their voices if they spoke loud enough, and sure enough, I could already hear their muffled chatter through the thin cabin walls. They headed inside, oblivious, with their bags and their precious secret in tow. The phone started buzzing with my carefully planned messages about an hour after they'd settled in. Lily's phone went first, a notification from Marissa, which I knew would catch her attention. I imagined her looking down, seeing the preview that read, "Had a great time last night, Ryan, winky face. Let's meet again soon?" She'd probably play it cool at first, just check the message, try to act like she didn't care. But with Lily, I knew better. Once the seed was planted, her jealousy would start eating away at her. She always had this controlling side, though she hid it well. A few minutes later, I sent the next text to Ryan's phone, from James. This one was simple but enough to shake him a little. "Hey Lily, it's been a while, miss talking to you. Maybe we should catch up." I'd created a story for James that hinted at him being an old friend from before we were married, someone Lily could never quite forget. Nothing too explicit, just enough to make Ryan second-guess things. Then I waited. It wasn't long before I heard raised voices, their tone shifting from light-hearted to tense. Lily was asking Ryan about something. Couldn't catch every word, but I could tell from the tone that she was agitated. Ryan tried to play it off, probably calling her paranoid or dramatic, but I knew her. She'd press him, insisting on answers, demanding to know why he was getting messages from another woman. This back and forth went on for a while, just as I'd expected. I let them stew in it, fueled by the steady drip of messages I'd set to go off every hour or so. Sometimes it'd be a random "I miss you" or "can't wait to see you again." Things that seemed harmless on the surface but packed with just enough weight to twist the knife deeper. By the time night fell, they were barely talking, each one avoiding the other's gaze. I could picture Lily seething with jealousy, scrolling through the Marissa messages, wondering if she'd misjudged Ryan, if maybe he wasn't so different from the husband she thought she was outsmarting. And Ryan? He was looking at his phone too, tapping his fingers on the table, probably wondering how many other old friends Lily had kept in touch with without telling him. From my cabin, I watched the lights flicker out one by one. Even from here, I could feel the tension I'd built up between them. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I could feel the tension in the cabin even from my place next door. Through the window, I saw them sitting across from each other at the little table, barely talking. They each had their phones in hand, their expressions flickering between anger and unease. It was almost funny, the very devices they'd used to keep their little secret were now tools of suspicion. I sent the first message of the day just as they were finishing their breakfast. Lily's phone buzzed, and she glanced down, her face immediately tightening as she read it. I hope you're still thinking about me, Ryan. I can't stop thinking about last night. She went pale, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white, but she forced herself to stay calm, trying to act like she didn't care. She didn't last long. A few minutes later, she slid her phone across the table, pointing at the screen. Who's Marissa? She asked, her voice low but steely. Ryan glanced at the screen, brow furrowing as he read the message. I don't know who that is, Lily, he said slowly, clearly choosing his words carefully. It's probably some crazy person who got the wrong number. Oh, really? She snapped, crossing her arms. Some random person who knows your name and where you're staying? Do you think I'm stupid? Ryan let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his temples. Look, I don't have time for your paranoia, Lily. I'm here with you, aren't I? Isn't that enough? She glared at him, lips pressed together, trying to read his face. But then his own phone buzzed, and he frowned, picking it up. His jaw clenched as he read. Just tell her already. She'll find out sooner or later, anyway. Lily leaned in, catching the flicker of guilt in his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? She demanded, her voice rising. Who's James? Why would he say that? Ryan looked up, anger flashing in his eyes as he met her gaze. I don't know who this guy is, Lily, and honestly, I don't have to explain myself to you. I thought we trusted each other. Lily scoffed, shaking her head. All right, trust. You're talking about trust while you're getting messages from some woman? I'm not the one hiding things here. Ryan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You think you're the only one who's hurt here? How do you think it feels to see some guy talking to you like that? They stood facing each other, both breathing hard, both too stubborn to admit anything but too rattled to let it go. Their words echoed through the cabin, and I could practically feel the walls closing in on them. They were trapped, each one clinging to their lies, each one wondering if the other had really been loyal. I didn't even need to send more messages. The doubts were already doing the work for me. Eventually, Lily broke the silence, her voice shaky but defiant. I need some air, she muttered, grabbing her jacket and storming out the door. She walked out into the cold, pacing up and down the little path outside, her breath coming out in angry bursts as she gripped her phone, staring down at the words that were driving her mad. Inside, Ryan stayed put, scrolling through the James messages with a scowl, suspicion and resentment etched across his face. He was too proud to chase after her, too angry to let it go. They were both right where I wanted them, lost in their own doubts, drowning in distrust. I just had to wait for the final cracks to show. When Lily returned to the cabin, her face was guarded, eyes sharp with a tension that hadn't been there before. She walked past Ryan, dropped her phone on the table, and stood by the window, staring out at the woods. Ryan watched her, his jaw clenched, deciding if he should speak or keep his distance. The silence was thick, both of them too stubborn to be the first to break it. Finally, Ryan sighed, his voice laced with an edge of frustration. Are you going to ignore me all weekend? Lily turned, fixing him with a hard stare. Ignore you? That's rich, coming from the guy who has some Marissa sending him messages about last night. Her tone was accusatory, a controlled anger behind it. Ryan shook his head, exasperated. Lily, I don't know this Marissa. It's probably a prank, or maybe someone's messing with us. He studied her, then asked, but what about James? Is that a mistake too? Lily's face paled, her mouth twisting in frustration. "There's nothing going on with anyone named James. Maybe you're projecting." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "Of course. I'm the problem. It's always me, isn't it?" Their words carried a weight far beyond the messages. This was everything they hadn't said before, every doubt and frustration simmering beneath the surface. Now they couldn't pretend anymore. The facade was starting to break. From my cabin, I watched them, each trying to hold on to control but clearly struggling. I could see Lily glancing back at her phone, likely thinking over the words from Marissa. How long had she been there? What else was Ryan hiding? And Ryan, he kept scrolling through the James messages, lips pressed in a thin line, maybe wondering if he'd ever truly known Lily. The uncertainty on his face was satisfying, like he was finally feeling what he'd forced me to feel. After a moment, Lily grabbed her coat again, this time turning to him with cold resolve. "I need to take a walk," she said, her voice flat. Ryan shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "Go ahead. I don't need to explain myself to someone who won't be honest with me, either." She paused, as if to say something more, but then just shook her head and stepped outside. I watched her disappear down the path into the woods. Ryan sat back down at the table, staring blankly at the door. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through the texts I'd planted, trying to make sense of it all. But he wouldn't find an answer, only more questions, more doubt. The cracks between them were splitting wider, the trust they'd built eroding as they tried to find a way to make sense of their own suspicions. By the time they left, they wouldn't recognize what they thought they had. As the hours passed, I could see the weight of those messages settling on them, turning every glance into a challenge, every word into a test. When Lily finally returned from her walk, she didn't look at Ryan, just slipped off her coat and sat silently by the fireplace. Ryan didn't look up either. He was still scrolling through his phone, his expression dark and brooding. The silence stretched painfully, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Finally, Ryan let out a bitter sigh and spoke, barely lifting his gaze from his phone. "So, are you going to tell me who James really is?" His voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. Lily clenched her jaw, turning to face him with a look of defiance. "There's nothing to tell, Ryan. But maybe you should tell me who Marissa is, since you're clearly getting texts from her at all hours." "Unbelievable," Ryan muttered, shaking his head. "You're deflecting. This James guy, he's sending you messages like you've got a history. And yet you're acting like you're the victim here." Lily scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "You're accusing me without any proof. I have no idea who James is, just like you supposedly don't know this Marissa." Ryan laughed bitterly, throwing his phone onto the table. "Proof? What about these texts you're reading right here, Lily? I'm seeing it with my own eyes." They both fell silent, each refusing to yield, each too wrapped up in their suspicions to see anything else. Their phones lay between them on the table, symbols of everything they'd hidden, everything they'd tried to keep secret. Watching them, I could tell they were both trying to process the possibility that they'd each been fooled, that maybe neither of them had been as clever or as loyal as they thought. After a few moments, Lily took a deep breath, as if calming herself, and asked quietly, "Do you really think I'm that kind of person, Ryan? That I'd just be sneaking around with someone else?" Ryan's expression softened, just for a moment, and I almost thought he might back down. But then his face hardened again, and he muttered, "I don't know, Lily. Maybe I thought I knew you." They sat there, staring at each other in the flickering firelight, both looking exhausted but refusing to give in. I watched them, a strange satisfaction brewing inside me as I realized how deeply those cracks were settling in. I didn't need to send more messages. I'd done my part. Now, their own doubts would eat away at them. After a long silence, Lily finally stood up, shaking her head. "I can't do this right now," she said softly, turning away and heading toward the bedroom. Ryan didn't move, didn't call after her. He just sat there, his face set in stone, as she left him alone in the dim cabin. From my spot next door, I knew that by the time this weekend was over, they wouldn't be able to look at each other without wondering who they were really dealing with. By the next morning, the cabin was as silent as a tomb. I could see them moving around inside, but they barely acknowledged each other. Ryan spent most of the morning outside, pacing along the edge of the forest, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his head down. Meanwhile, Lily stayed inside, absently scrolling through her phone, looking as if she were trying to decode every message she'd read, every word she'd heard from him. Around noon, I sent a final, subtle message to each of their phones. Something small but enough to dig deeper. On Ryan's, James had sent a single line. "Wish you'd told me about the cabin, Lily. Could have been just like old times." On Lily's, Marissa had written, "Still thinking about you, Ryan. I wish you'd just tell her the truth." I watched as they each read the messages, their expressions darkening. Ryan took a deep breath and went back inside, his steps heavy. He found Lily at the table, scrolling through the old messages, looking lost in thought. Without a word, he dropped his phone in front of her, showing her Marissa's newest message. Lily glanced at it, her face twisting in anger. She tossed her phone onto the table, where Ryan could see James's message clearly. "There. Now we both know," she said flatly. They stared at each other, each waiting for the other to break, to admit something, but neither did. Lily leaned back, crossing her arms. "So, what now, Ryan? Do we just go back and pretend this didn't happen?" Ryan scoffed, running a hand over his face. "You're the one who wanted this weekend. So go ahead. Tell me what you want from me, Lily." She shook her head, her voice low and tense. "I wanted us to get away from everything, to just be ourselves without all this noise." She gestured at the phones with a bitter smile. "But I guess even that was too much to hope for." Ryan leaned forward, his voice tense but soft. "Maybe we both wanted something that wasn't real." His words hung in the air, heavy with everything they hadn't said before. Lily's expression softened for a second, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face, but then she closed herself off again. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, almost to herself. They sat there in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. I could see the resignation settling in, the realization that whatever they'd thought they'd had was slipping away, broken by suspicion and secrets. Eventually, Lily got up and walked out, leaving Ryan alone at the table, staring at his phone like it held all the answers he'd never get. And from where I watched, I knew they were beginning to understand just how deeply their betrayal would cost them. Lily stayed outside for a long time, pacing back and forth on the gravel path, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked like she was steeling herself for something, maybe working up the courage to end this nightmare once and for all. But whatever resolve she had seemed to falter as she stood there, looking out into the woods, lost in thought. Eventually, she went back inside, her shoulders tense. Ryan was still at the table, staring at his phone. She sat down across from him, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, they just sat there, the silence thick between them. "Maybe we need to talk," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan glanced up, his eyes narrowed. "About what, Lily? Seems like all the talking we've done hasn't gotten us anywhere." Lily looked down, twisting her hands together, as if she didn't quite know what to say. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. "I don't know how we got here, Ryan. This isn't us." She looked up, her gaze searching his face for something. Understanding, maybe, or forgiveness. Ryan's expression softened just a bit, and for a second, I thought they might actually try to patch things up. But then he shook his head, his face hardening again. "Isn't it? Because, from where I'm sitting, it feels like maybe we've just been pretending." Lily flinched, as though he'd slapped her. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. After a long pause, she said quietly, "If that's really how you feel, then, maybe this was a mistake." Ryan leaned back, his arms crossed. Maybe it was. They sat there in the thick silence, each of them too proud or too hurt to take a step back, to try and rebuild the trust that had been shattered. They both knew that even if they tried, those doubts, those questions, would always be there, lurking under the surface. Finally, Lily stood up, looking at him with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I think I'm going to head back early," she said, her voice hollow. Ryan nodded, not meeting her gaze. "Yeah, maybe that's best." Without another word, Lily turned and walked to the bedroom, gathering her things. Ryan stayed put, staring into the fire as if he could find answers in the flames. Neither of them looked back, both silently agreeing that whatever they'd had was over. Watching them from my cabin, I felt a strange satisfaction mixed with an unexpected emptiness. They'd finally seen each other's flaws laid bare, felt the sting of betrayal just as I had. And now, there was no going back for either of them. As Lily packed up her things in the bedroom, Ryan sat alone in the living room, lost in thought. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a distant, almost resigned look, like he was trying to accept what had happened but hadn't quite managed to come to terms with it. After a few minutes, Lily emerged from the bedroom, her bag slung over her shoulder. She hesitated by the door, glancing back at Ryan. For a second, it looked like she wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, she simply nodded, a gesture as hollow as it was final, and reached for the doorknob. Lily, Ryan's voice stopped her, low and unexpectedly calm. She paused, looking back at him, her face tight with uncertainty. "I don't know what happens next," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on her. "But I think we're better off going our separate ways." Lily swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Yeah, maybe we are." She tried to hold his gaze, but the hurt in her eyes was unmistakable. She turned away quickly, as if to keep him from seeing it. Then, without another word, she stepped outside, the door closing behind her with a dull click that seemed to echo through the cabin. Ryan stayed there, unmoving, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked down at his phone one last time, scrolling through the messages, as if searching for some explanation, something to ease the sting of their unraveling. But there was nothing there, just fragments of a trust that had been broken beyond repair. I watched as he set the phone down slowly, looking defeated, hollowed out. There was no fury, no outburst, just a quiet resignation, as if he finally understood that whatever they'd once shared was gone. After a few more minutes, Ryan got up and gathered his own things. He didn't linger or look around the cabin, he just packed up his bag and headed toward the door, his face expressionless. When he left, he didn't look back, just stepped out into the cold, empty morning, closing the door on whatever future they might have had. As I watched them both leave, one after the other, I knew they were walking away with scars that would stay with them, a lingering reminder of what they'd lost. And as they drove off in separate directions, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality, a satisfaction that came not from anger but from knowing that, like me, they'd have to live with the echoes of their betrayal. After they'd both left, the cabin was empty, silent, and somehow colder. I stepped inside, looking around the room they'd shared, now just an echo of their lost connection. Their abandoned coffee mugs were still on the table, the ashes in the fireplace barely smoldering. I stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over me. I picked up their phones from the table, knowing I had no need for them anymore. My plan had worked. They'd turned on each other, each one doubting the other so deeply that whatever had once been there was gone for good. But now, standing here in the aftermath, I felt something unexpected, a heaviness, almost a kind of sadness. Not for them, not for what they'd done, but for the person I used to be before all of this. This was supposed to bring relief, a sense of justice. And yet, it felt different. I'd won, but that victory was hollow, like an empty room echoing back nothing but silence. I went through the cabin, clearing out any sign I'd been there. Wiped down surfaces, took my things, left it as spotless as I'd found it. Soon, it looked like no one had ever been there at all, like their twisted weekend had been nothing but a nightmare they wouldn't fully understand, something that would haunt them in ways they wouldn't be able to shake. With everything gathered, I left the cabin and took one last look at the place. There was a finality in walking away, in leaving it behind, knowing that I'd done what I'd set out to do. I'd made my point, exacted my revenge, and broken down the lies that had hidden their betrayal. As I drove away, I felt something else settle in, a calm, almost bittersweet acceptance. I couldn't change what they'd done, and nothing could bring back the life I'd thought I'd had. But I was done letting their lies control me. By the time I reached the main road, I wasn't thinking of Lily or Ryan. I was thinking about what came next. The drive back felt longer than the one to the cabin, the road stretching out like a quiet reminder of everything that had changed. For the first time since discovering the affair, my mind wasn't swirling with anger or plans for revenge. Instead, I felt almost calm, like a chapter had closed. I hadn't planned this far. I'd put everything into the setup, into making sure they'd feel the weight of their own lies, but now, without that purpose driving me, there was just an odd emptiness. Still, something was different, a kind of freedom I hadn't felt since the day I'd first suspected Lily. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same, but everything about it felt changed. The memories, the life we'd built, it was all different now. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence sink in, before finally stepping inside. Inside, the familiar sights hit me like a wave. The framed photos, the little souvenirs from trips we'd taken together, all the reminders of a life that felt distant, almost like it belonged to someone else. But strangely, instead of feeling angry or bitter, I felt a need to reclaim it. To make this place mine again. The first thing I did was take down the photos of us together, setting them in a box to be dealt with later. I kept some things, ones that felt like they held meaning outside of her, reminders of my own life, not the life we'd built on lies. As I moved through the house, reclaiming it piece by piece, I felt lighter, the weight of betrayal lifting bit by bit. In the living room, I found her favorite throw blanket, the one she'd wrap herself in during movies. I tossed it in a pile, along with the knickknacks she'd chosen, her favorite books, the mug she'd bought us for our perfect mornings. All of it was heading out. This place was mine now, and every item that didn't feel like me had to go. As night fell, I sat in the quiet of my new space. There was still a dull ache, a sense of loss for what I'd once believed in, but for the first time, it felt like something I could live with. The anger, the revenge, it had all run its course, and what was left was simply me. I knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to rebuild, on my terms this time. I didn't know exactly what the future would look like, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to find out. The days after the cabin were quiet, almost unsettlingly so. 4 years, my life had been shaped by Lily's presence. Her music in the mornings, her perfume lingering in rooms. Now, there was only silence, but instead of feeling haunted, I felt oddly free. I took my time, reclaiming the house room by room. The first few mornings were hard, small details like her favorite mug in the cabinet or her bathrobe in the bathroom hitting me unexpectedly. But each reminder became a reason to change things, to erase her presence one piece at a time. The living room was my first real project. I'd always gone along with her choices, but now I wanted this space to reflect me. I went to the hardware store, picked a soft blue for the walls, and spent the weekend painting, letting the rhythm of the work clear my mind. When I finished, the room felt lighter, like a weight had lifted. I rearranged the furniture, trying new layouts until it felt like my own space. Her throw blankets, decorative pillows, and favorite magazines went into a box, along with every item that didn't feel like me. One evening, sorting through another box, I found our wedding album. I hadn't seen it in a while. It was tucked behind other things on a shelf. I sat down, flipping through it slowly, letting memories wash over me. There I was, looking so full of joy and trust, completely sure that what we'd had was real. I felt a strange mix of pity and sorrow for that version of myself, so devoted to an illusion. After a few minutes, I closed the album and placed it back in the box, not with anger, but with a sense of calm. This wasn't my story anymore, and holding on to it felt pointless. It was time to leave it behind. As weeks passed, I reached out to old friends I'd drifted away from over the years. People I'd lost touch with while trying to be the perfect husband in a life that hadn't really reflected who I was. They were surprised to hear from me but welcomed me back without questions. I also started revisiting hobbies I'd set aside, like woodworking. I found a side table I'd made years ago, neglected and dusty in the garage, and decided to restore it. Sanding it down and giving it a new finish felt almost symbolic, a way of reclaiming the parts of myself I'd let go. One night, as I sat in my newly painted living room, the soft blue walls glowing in the evening light, I realized this house finally felt like mine. The weight of betrayal, the anger, and the need for revenge were fading, replaced by a quiet resilience. For the first time, I felt ready to look forward, to build a life that was truly my own. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done being haunted by the past. This was my chance to rediscover who I was, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. As I settled into this new life, a surprising sense of peace began to settle in with it. I started to appreciate the quiet routines that made up my days, the early mornings with a cup of coffee in my newly arranged living room, the weekends spent working on small projects around the house. Little by little, the home I'd shared with Lily became something different, a place that reflected only me. I focused on work, throwing myself into projects with a focus I hadn't had in years. My colleagues noticed the change, and a few of them even commented on it, asking if I'd been doing something different. I just shrugged, not sure how to explain that I'd cut out the weight of a life built on lies. For the first time, my work felt like an extension of who I was, not a means to support a life I'd been unknowingly sharing with someone else. As the weeks went by, I started exploring things beyond the house and work. I signed up for a woodworking class at a local community center. Being there, learning something I was genuinely passionate about, felt strangely fulfilling, like rediscovering a part of myself I'd buried away. I even met a few people who shared similar interests, no one I knew closely yet, but it was refreshing to connect without the weight of the past hanging over me. One evening after class, I took a drive to the nearby lake. It was the kind of place Lily would never have bothered with. Too quiet, too plain. I parked by the shore, watching the water shift gently under the fading light. Sitting there, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. It was simple, just the sounds of the lake and the evening air, but it felt right. A month later, I received an unexpected message from an old friend, Mark. He'd heard about the divorce through mutual friends and invited me out to catch up. At first, I hesitated, but something in me knew I was ready. When we met up, he didn't ask for details or bring up the past. He just treated me like the friend he'd known years before, back when I was still figuring things out. As we talked, I realized how much I'd missed this kind of connection. Real friendships, real moments. These were things I'd let drift away, too focused on building a life that had ultimately been built on deception. Spending time with Mark and the friends I was reconnecting with, I started to understand that my life was richer now, even in its simplicity, than it had been when I was constantly trying to be something I wasn't. When I got home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. I didn't need anything elaborate or dramatic to feel whole again. The satisfaction of real connections, of being true to myself, that was enough. And as I lay down that night, I knew that, at last, I was free. The life I'd built wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was mine. The months went by, each one bringing a new layer of clarity. I'd kept busy, filled my days with new routines and people, but the most unexpected shift came from within. The anger and betrayal had faded to a point where, instead of bitterness, I just felt a quiet acceptance. What had happened was part of my story now, but it didn't control me anymore. One evening, as I was clearing out an old drawer, I came across the last of Lily's things. Small odds and ends I hadn't noticed before. A pair of earrings, an old scarf, a couple of cards she'd once written. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with them. But then, without overthinking it, I gathered everything up, walked out to the backyard, and tossed it all into the fire pit. As I watched the small flames flicker, I thought about the person I'd been when I'd first met her, about the hopes I'd had, and the person I'd worked so hard to be for her. And then, just as quickly, I let those thoughts drift away with the smoke. There was no point in clinging to memories of what might have been. That chapter was over, and I'd finally made my peace with it. Over the next few weeks, I started setting new goals, things I'd never made time for. I signed up for a 10K, something I'd always talked about but had never actually done. I even joined a group of local runners to keep me accountable, a mix of people who had no idea who I was or what I'd been through. It was refreshing, no past, no judgments, just people enjoying the present. On weekends, I often found myself back at the lake, bringing a notebook and jotting down small goals or ideas. I started sketching plans for furniture I wanted to build, thinking of new ways to challenge myself with my woodworking. Sometimes I'd meet a friend there, or sometimes I'd just enjoy the quiet, the sense of being fully present in my own life. Slowly but surely, I felt myself coming back to life in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was moving forward, not in big dramatic ways, but in small, steady steps that felt right. One Saturday morning, I ran into Mark again at a local coffee shop, and we ended up sitting down together, just talking about life, plans, and the things we'd both let go of over the years. He mentioned taking a hiking trip in the spring, something he used to do often but had let slip, and invited me along. Without hesitation, I agreed. I knew then that I was no longer looking back, no longer haunted by what could have been. My life, imperfect as it was, felt full again, not because of anyone else, but because of who I'd become through it all. And as I walked out of that coffee shop, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free.